From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. One of the big political issues this summer is small boats. Despite Labour promising to smash the gangs, we have had 50,000 people illegally cross the Channel since the election. There's been anger and violence in places like Epping. New policy from government, speeding up asylum applications, and a one-in, one-out deal with the French.
People coming illegally on small boats can be returned, and in exchange, we will transfer people who've applied lawfully and who've been through proper security checks.
But who is actually in these small boats?
It wasn't what we would have thought would be the beginning of the story of, thousands of people risking their lives to come to the UK for a better life.
A reporter colleague has been looking deep into one particular and perhaps surprising nationality, making up a big chunk of those illegally crossing the Channel. The story today. Inside the fastest growing human trafficking route to the UK.
I'm Shayma Bakht and I'm a general reporter at The Times, but I specialise in foreign reports and investigations.
And a lot of migration as well, is that fair?
Yes, I do. Quite often under the remit of Home Affairs.
And what kind of migration-y things have you done in the past?
So previously followed the smuggling route from Poland and Belarus into the UK. We also followed a Kurdish smuggling ring based in Dunkirk and Calais, and the desk was, really interested in figuring out who was behind it, and we managed to track them down. So, yeah.
I remember it well. With this, though, you're focusing on Vietnam.
Yes.
How did you set your sights on Vietnam?
So last year around this time, the data on small boats was published by the Home Office, and unusually the biggest nationality represented on the Channel on these small boats coming to the UK were the Vietnamese, and they ended up being the biggest nationality on the Channel for the first 6 months. And it kind of felt like that had erupted out of nowhere. Just to put it into context, in 2018, there were just 4 Vietnamese migrants coming to the UK on small boats. And last year there were 3,600. And obviously Vietnam is not your typical war-torn country. It's not in the middle of a modern war. Its economy is considered to be booming by experts. And it was even praised by the UN as being really impressive in reducing poverty. So it was kind of figuring out why people were travelling there, especially with the context of the tragic Essex lorry incident that happened in 2019, where 39 people, who were all Vietnamese migrants, suffocated inside of a sealed container whilst being smuggled to the UK.
The bodies were discovered in the container at Waterglade Industrial Park in Grays in the early hours of this morning. 38 adults and 1 teenager were pronounced dead at the scene. A 25-year-old man from Northern Ireland has been arrested on suspicion of murder.
And then we also have more recent reports of undocumented migrants who are Vietnamese being trapped in slave-like conditions in the UK. So it just didn't really add up why so many people would suddenly want to come to the UK. And I think that was what we were trying to figure out, is that big question of why.
And to answer that, you've got to go to Vietnam, I guess. So where did you go and why?
So I actually started off looking at the Essex lorry incident, and I was trying to figure out where the majority of those migrants had come from. More than half travelled from a region called Nha An. And it kind of matched up with what many experts said, which is that this kind of movement is concentrated in central Vietnam, where most people are leaving from. And that's historically a poor area. To put it into context, a job here in the UK, even below minimum wage, is equivalent to to 10 times the pay of a standard job in central Vietnam. And we knew that they weren't coming from Hanoi, they're not traditionally coming from Ho Chi Minh, which are both more affluent areas. So I flew directly into Hanoi, and there I met a local journalist who was really familiar with the story, and together we travelled to Nha An.
And was Nha An immediately, visibly quite poor? I mean, was it clear to you why people were leaving?
Yes and no. It was really strange. You get out of the airport we flew into Vinh, and you're driving through and you see these rural kind of, rice paddy fields and even some bamboo houses and real poverty in some parts. And then you drive a little further and you come across mansions and really, really wealthy areas. But that's all recent. We learned very quickly that that was actually a direct result of people being smuggled abroad, and many of these migrants abroad sending money back to their families, which obviously converts into a lot of money in the Vietnamese dong and is able to pay for these enormous mansions.
Well, you say enormous mansions. I got sent a video from you a little bit earlier on called Billionaire Village.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, I mean, there are mansions, then there are mansions. The thing I'm looking at here is what looks like at least a 3-story mansion with these enormous arched glass windows. It's white. It looks sort of almost sort of like Houseman's Paris, except with a few enormous bronze-looking sculptures in the middle and either side of the roof. I mean, it looks incredibly expensive and glam.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen a house that looks like that, even in some of the richest parts of London. It was really shocking to see, and it wasn't the only one. We saw, rows of these massive mansions with gold and bronze statues of Jesus and statues of lions and dozens of really expensive cars in the front.
Did you call it Billionaire's Village? Is that what it actually is?
No, so it's actually, that's what it's locally known as too. The real name is Do Tan, but locals also refer to it as Billionaire's Village just because it really is so unusual to see that many mansions and that level of wealth in this really rural and poor province.
So you've got this incredibly poor part of Vietnam where actually there's this bit which is quite wealthy because of the amount of people sending money back from jobs in the UK to help support family back home. Why is it the case that so many people from one little part of this province have ended up making the journey to the UK? You'd think it would be quite broadly spread across the province or just all the poor parts of Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, we spoke to a couple of experts about this because it really was puzzling initially. Why this area? Why not other parts of Vietnam? I think it's rooted in the fact that this was a very poor area to start with, but also we spoke to an expert, Hai Long, and he works with local law enforcement and the British law enforcement, and he told us that they use this specific tactic, which translates to the fellow countryman association tactic. And it's basically because people in that province typically would work as a community. They like to work alongside people who they know, who they trust. And so when one person is moved over to somewhere like the UK and has set up either a nail salon or, a cannabis farms, as we've seen, they want to recruit people who they know and trust only. And that's actually what we saw with the Essex lorry incident, was that many of these people knew each other and had been referred on by one person who'd known others.
So I leave from my one small part of a poor province in Vietnam, go to the UK, make, comparatively to my friends and family back home, a fortune, send money back, but also recruit people to come and make the same journey as me to the UK because, if I've got a business or I want more people to work with me, I want people not just from Vietnam, but from literally where I'm from, people I'll probably know.
Exactly that.
So if that's where the journey begins, if I'm off to go and make this route to the UK, where is my first stop?
Some people go directly onwards outside of the country, but in the last year at least, we'd spoken to dozens of undocumented migrants in the UK who had said that these smugglers are giving them false advertisements for these jobs in the black market, and that actually there's very few. And instead they'd been encouraged to upskill And some of them had been told about affiliated nail academies in Vietnam, in bigger cities. We found one in Hanoi, and we were aware that there had been some people from Nha An who had travelled to Hanoi to some nail academies. So we wanted to see what we would find.
So you went to this one in Hanoi. What did it look like as you approached?
It just looked like a shop, to be honest with you, with this massive sign on the front, lots of pictures, lots of flags, actually. And in the back was this really tightly packed classroom. And it was kind of amazing. It was decorated from kind of floor to ceiling in bejeweled nails and different nail sets that students had worked on. Lots of certificates around the side. And in it was this really glamorous looking nail technician who was leading this academy. And she said that she trained 7,000 people. And her name was Can Lee Chung. And yeah, she told us that the majority of her students want to move abroad.
Okay, so there are two types of students. One is go there under the investment visa. And the second one is like for the working class. A lot of people from the central Vietnam, like Nghệ An and Quang Binh, they go there illegally and they cross the channel and they go to Hungary and then go to UK.
Yeah.
And she knows like quite a lot of people doing it, and she still knows like someone's there.
And she was just giving them a combination of the kind of actual tangible skills of knowing how to give a good manicure, put on acrylics, but then also was including English lessons and lessons in British etiquette and teaching her students how to say thank you and please and refer to people as sir and madam.
Hello, what do you want to know? Thì nói được như thế. Mấy cái từ mà
But when we walked in, what was unusual was that there was a man who was sitting on the sofa and he started taking pictures of us, and we thought that's really weird.
What did you say to him?
Well, we firstly said, why are you taking pictures? Can you delete those? And Trung said, oh, don't worry about it. He's my co-founder. He's the business partner. We don't normally get journalists. And then she got him to delete them also, I hope. And, when we were done kind of speaking to her, taking a tour around the academy, he actually offered us a ride back home. And we didn't want him to take us to our hotel, but we thought it might have been worth going on part of that journey with him because he was being quite quiet and closed off the whole time, and he started to kind of open up when he offered us this journey. And yeah, we thought we were together and we would just keep our wits about us, and it seemed okay. So we got in the car, and almost as soon as we closed the door, he started talking, and we did not realise what he would say. But he very quickly admitted that he worked as, in his own words, a broker or a smuggler to connect students at this academy. And he said he kind of specialised in Nha An, so from that province, to people in Europe and in the USA. And he gave us this huge amount of detail about how people were able to kind of hide themselves in containers, rub garlic on themselves to mask their scent from sniffer dogs. It was just this huge amount of detail. And then also was really interesting because Trung denied that there was any affiliation with this academy, with the smuggling network. So she admitted many of her students want to go abroad through this kind of illegal route. But he said that he very much used an arm of it to connect people and to make money and to work alongside other criminal networks in different continents.
So I'm from a poor province in Vietnam. I want to go to the UK. I go to somewhere like this to learn skills so I can earn a good wage when I get to the UK. This example is a nail academy. So your woman who runs this academy, she's not doing anything illegal there, and I think even denied to you that she is involved in people smuggling of any kind. Your man, though, who is connected to that, tells you that he helps people onwards. Where does he help them onwards to? If you were to go on that route, where's his first stop for you?
Well, he said he specialises in a few places. So he helps people into Europe and the US, but he makes it very clear that from Europe, that is where almost everyone is moving towards the UK. He tells us that he will help them, as long as they can get a tourist visa, he will help them then be connected to people who can take them across borders in cars and then onwards in boats if necessary.
So a tourist visa to somewhere in Europe that isn't the UK. And is that quite easy to do as a Vietnamese person?
It's actually not, because the EU is aware that there is an existing smuggling corridor that goes through Europe into the UK, or, through Europe to remain as undocumented migrants. And so they've put in some measures to kind of figure out who's going there legitimately. And they ask for a really comprehensive travel itinerary from people who say that they're going as tourists. And we found out that there are tourism companies in Hanoi who are kind of helping forge those itineraries with affiliated businesses in the EU. This is something that Europol's picked up on too. So businesses with front names that are actually not real and are operating on behalf of these smuggling networks that are being used to look as though they're legitimately working there, or they're legitimately travelling to visit these family and friends that don't exist.
So I have a kind of fake 2-week itinerary for Berlin or wherever,
exactly.
Which actually I'm not going to do.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, we were told by one business owner in Nha An, actually, he went as far as to say that he could make it really easy for someone who has an older passport, because he could make it look as though they'd already travelled to 4 different countries in the EU. And that obviously does look convincing, because these people are going in and out and they're going back to Vietnam. And he said that his success rate, if they have an older passport, which is more easily able to have these fake stamps on them, is something like 90 to 100%. So it really is a kind of group effort from all of these different parts in Vietnam and then in Europe and onwards.
So if that has got you from Vietnam to somewhere within the EU, how do they then make their way to the UK? What's the next stop?
So there's obviously a variety of routes, but we followed the most popular one. And we found that people were typically going into places like Germany. And from there, they would cross the borders in cars. And we spoke to one undocumented migrant now in the UK, in Birmingham, actually, who said that he paid about $500 for a 4-seater car, so sharing it with 3 other migrants, to cross the German border into France and onwards into Dunkirk and Calais, where boats will depart. But he told us that he thought that was going to be kind of as quickly as possible, but he was kept there for a few months. And we know from other people we've spoken to that they were not given that transport until much later, months later, years later. And in the meantime, they are expected to work for these smuggling networks and their front businesses. It's in many ways a sort of debt bondage.
Then the plan next would be, I guess, to move through France towards the coast and the UK. How do people know who to go to, where to go to, who might be able to sort this out for them?
Well, actually, there's a really clear pathway because of things like TikTok, where undocumented migrants who have made the journey have posted the whole journey from start to finish in Europe and then in northern France onto the UK. And I've looked at some of these TikTok videos and I've seen dozens, honestly. And you see in the comments that there's lots of questions from people who are in Vietnam asking, how much did it cost and how long does it take? And there's a real audience for this. Actually, there's been a few investigations by the Home Office and the NCA. They realised that it seems as though smugglers are encouraging these migrants to post their journeys using coded words and things like that, because they've realised it's a really good way to advertise and glamorise this trip and make it seem safe and, something that people should aspire to.
Shayma, you've been explaining the route that many Vietnamese migrants take from Vietnam into Europe and then hoping to get to the UK. They've flown into the Schengen zone, the sort of borderless EU zone. They've now got through to France and to Dunkirk, I think you said, on the coast facing the UK. When you went to some of these encampments, which still exist there, how did you find the Vietnamese there?
So I actually went back to the same area that I had been in around this time last year, a little bit later last year, when I was following these Kurdish smuggling rings. And I didn't know if it would still be active. A lot of these encampments get torn down by the French authorities, and then people just move or, disperse in smaller camps. But it was still really whole, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people camped out there. So when we arrived, I kind of approached some of these men who were quite obviously running the camps. They were typically Kurdish Iraqi. And I just asked them, do you know where the Vietnamese are camping? Because we understood from our sources that they would typically stay as a group. And just to describe Dunkirk's camp, which is known as the jungle, it's basically a forest, right? And people are camping out in the middle of bushes and shrubs and trees. And it can be really hard to figure out where people are because they're literally in between all of this kind of greenery. And he told us that he had seen about 100 people further up north is kind of the direction he pointed. So we started walking in that direction. At first, we couldn't find anyone. We found a couple of Vietnamese people who didn't want to talk, but they were very much in their own little tent and we couldn't see anyone around them. So we knew that it couldn't be this group that he was talking about. Before going to Dunkirk and Calais, I was aware that it would be really important to have a journalist who is Vietnamese who can speak the language to approach these people, because previously other news outlets have tried and they've failed because they've not had someone fronting it who's from the country. And I found a brilliant journalist who's based in London, but who was born in Vietnam. And she recognised this Vietnamese opera music, which is really popular in the country. And it was just being blasted at full. And she said, really excited. She was like, this way. And we kind of followed the sound, It was really funny. I've never really kind of tracked down people in that way. But it was very much, we followed the music. And then we got to this, I can only describe it as kind of like a semicircle of like bushes. And then a open space that was being blocked by a shopping trolley. It was literally being used as a security barrier to stop people from going in. And we initially stood kind of at the entrance of that where we could hear the music. Then we saw a Vietnamese flag. We saw the Vietnamese coffee, Vietnamese cigarettes. We were like, we know where we are. And there were lots of chairs, lots of tents inside. We kind of peeked in and we started speaking to some people who were there. And they invited us in for a second and gave us, a little bit of context about they were planning to leave in the next few days. And then it very quickly got shut down by a man who was sat in the back, who the next day we realised was someone who was probably at the head of this operation because people kept saying he won't let us speak to you. We did try and go back. We were pushed away. It got actually quite heated. And that man started shouting us and we thought, okay, we're going to back away. We've seen where it is. That's all we're going to get. At least we know that they're there. And then we were stood in this area where charities were handing out lunch and we saw just two people who were buying a couple of baguettes. And they had life jackets in their hands, that they were Vietnamese. And we thought, they're probably getting on the boats. And we thought they were just going to be two people among a mixed nationality group going to the boats. We also didn't realise at this point that we were there just by chance on the busiest weekend of the year so far. We followed those two people and really quickly we saw this group of about 30 people who were all Vietnamese rushing, and we decided to follow them.
And where did they go?
So we tried to keep a distance. They were such a big group, we could kind of see them from miles off. They were walking through all of this kind of grassy and forest areas that I was telling you about where the encampments are, and went onwards to the road. And it was kind of shocking, actually, that they were walking in plain sight, very clearly with life jackets in their hands, massive group of Vietnamese migrants led by Kurdish man at the front and a couple of other people who looked like they were Middle Eastern. And then we were in our car, so we decided to go further ahead and wait and see how far they would go. And they stopped at a bus stop that we'd seen where lots of other migrants with life jackets who were not Vietnamese were stopping too. And then we decided to follow that bus. And we figured out it was a free bus and it took them directly to Gravelines Beach, which is where I think a lot of these boats are launching from at the moment. And at that point, we tried to make a decision on how long we would wait because they wouldn't immediately get on these boats and we didn't know whether we would stay out there in the night. And we decided to get back really early in the morning at around something like 4 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., when the light just, starts to break. What we saw were several boats, inflatable boats being pulled by these Kurdish smugglers. And the first thing that they called out was, Vietnamese, where are the Vietnamese? So they really were being given what we call a kind of priority service. We know that they're charged a lot more than other nationalities. I think it's in the ballpark of around $5,000 to $20,000 to make these trips.
Because they can afford it.
Because they can afford it. In my previous kind of investigations and dispatches, I was told by Kurdish smugglers that there is a bit of a ranking based on how much money a certain nationality typically earns or brings with them.
Because I guess it's a business, and if you can fill your boat as a smuggler full of Vietnamese people, it's going to be a lot more worth your while than if they're all Eritrean or Afghans.
And they know that they will pay more to have a shorter wait time. They are not needing to stay in these camps. We know Sudanese people who've stayed there for years because they're not seen as the priority. So they were boarding on these boats. It really, as a lot of these boat launches started with chaos, people jumping on the boats, children screaming, it being overloaded, fighting happening. But the Vietnamese had already secured their places, so they were on their way out.
So at the crack of dawn then, when you saw this happen, the shout goes out for the Vietnamese, they take their places. Is that by comparison quite an orderly dispatch over the channel?
The way that they were able to get their seats meant that they didn't have to fight for it, right? Whereas everyone else, it was first come, first serve. They constantly promise so that they can make this money a space on these boats, and it very rarely actually happens the first time, and they don't give that money back. So it was orderly for the Vietnamese and absolute chaos for everyone else. But after a bit of fighting, those boats went off, and I think we did check on how many of them actually arrived at the shore. A lot of them were picked up by coast guards and taken onwards, and others just made it the whole way and arrived on the shores. We know that a group of around 30 travelled in one night and are now probably here.
And once they're in the UK, you say some of them are being picked up by the authorities. Is it the case that all of them are clocked by the authorities and they, I guess, claim asylum and then have to wait through that long system, but in the meantime can crack on with their lives? Or is it the case that they just slip in undetected and get to work somewhere?
It's a combination. It depends if they were picked up by the coast guards or the local authorities or not. But a lot of the migrants that we speak to say that they hope that they are, because then they don't have to take the risky journey, right, the whole way, and they're brought to the shore. We know that the ones that are picked up are then placed in these hotels. We've just heard anecdotally from a lot of the Vietnamese undocumented migrants who are here in the UK that it's incredibly easy for them to leave. They just hop out of the door, sometimes climb out of the windows, and are met by Vietnamese relatives or friends or people from their community or the potential employers, and are taken on to shared accommodation. And then either, it depends what they have lined up, but it could be these nail salons in the UK, which we know often hire people under the table, or it can be these cannabis cultivation operations, which can be really, really horrific in terms of modern slavery and treatment.
In what kind of way?
We were told by one undocumented migrant that he wasn't allowed to leave these farms, that they weren't allowed to take phone calls, that they were forced to work all day, all night. They were often beaten. And he described there being, in his words, a cannabis mafia who, if they weren't happy with your crop, would either sell you on to another cannabis farm, or you would face some sort of punishment for that. So it sounds really terrifying, and you can't get out of it. But what's interesting about the stories of these undocumented migrants is that they really vary. And there's plenty of people who were promised a job in a cannabis farm, and they were hoping for a job despite what they've read about it, despite what they know, weren't able to get that place because it's just so oversaturated. There's so many people coming now. And these farms are being shut down by the NCA and British police. And there are other people who are really happy because they're earning a decent wage that they can send back. It doesn't feel like it's too much of a cost for them. So it really varies from who you're speaking to. But ultimately, we do see this often from people who are victims of modern slavery, that they're not always aware of the fact that their human rights have been eroded. They're just grateful to be paid.
And it can often mean that they're earning a lot more than they did before. As you say, they can send that back home. People get a nice idea of how fabulous life might be in the UK, and it self-perpetuates.
Exactly, and the cycle continues.
Now, you, Shayma, are not a police officer, as far as I'm aware,
No.
and yet you've been able to rumble this, in a few months and speak to all these people involved, and it's quite clear what the racket is. Where are the authorities on this?
So I spoke to the Home Office and they brought up that they've obviously signed this new agreement with Vietnam in April, which was effectively recommitting to working together, which they're already doing, to stop traffickers through coordinating efforts and by working together to disrupt them. They didn't really go into a ton of detail of how that would actually be done on the ground. And they've also started this social media campaign on Zalo, which is Vietnam's biggest messaging app. And I think they're pushing these messages out on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube too, to try and counteract what smugglers and undocumented migrants who are on that journey or have made that journey are saying to encourage people to come. And they say that that's reached millions of people. They've also got these repatriation flights. We know that there's been at least one with just a handful of people, and they're not being deterred by these repatriation flights, which have existed for a while. And the Home Office have kind of pointed towards the fact that in the first quarter of this year, it looks as though numbers are comparatively down to last year. But according to experts that I've spoken to, there's no real way to tell if any of this has been effective until much later in the year when we get the data from the summer months, which is when we have typically seen the Vietnamese crossing the channel. And of course, when I was there myself in Dunkirk in northern France, we saw hundreds of Vietnamese in the camps. So we know that there are people who are waiting to make that journey right now.
Shayma Bakht, reporter at The Times. You can read plenty more of her work over at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. And let us know what you thought of the story. The story at thetimes.com is how to email us. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Anna Dowell. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. And I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.